The first night, I woke to the sound of my own name spoken softly from the living room. It wasn't loud or urgent, just careful, like someone testing how it felt in their mouth. I lay still, listening for it again. In the morning, I told myself it had been a dream, the kind brought on by exhaustion and unfamiliar walls. Still, the apartment felt embarrassed somehow, as if it had revealed something too early and hoped I'd forget. The building manager had smiled too quickly when I signed the lease. "People move around a lot," he said, tapping the paper. I assumed he meant jobs, relationships, normal life turbulence. The price had convinced me not to ask follow-up questions. That evening, unpacking alone, I noticed a faint groove in the hardwood floor leading from the bedroom door to the couch. It looked like something dragged repeatedly, carefully, always along the same path. The next few days passed quietly, almost deliberately so. I settled into routines, morning coffee by the window, evening walks past the laundromat downstairs. The apartment behaved like any other place, offering nothing but neutral shelter. Sunlight moved cleanly through the rooms, revealing dust instead of secrets. The pipes knocked when hot water ran. The refrigerator hummed obediently. Ordinary sounds layered themselves into a sense of safety I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I worked from home, typing near the kitchen counter, taking calls without interruption. Neighbors nodded politely in the hall. No one lingered. Nothing felt watched. If anything, the building seemed eager to mind its own business. The cheap rent became a small victory I enjoyed repeating to friends. I joked about finally beating the city's cruelty. When they asked about the place, I described the light, the quiet, the way sleep came easily. At night, I read until my eyes burned, then drifted off without effort. No dreams lingered. No sounds intruded. The darkness felt complete, almost padded, as though the apartment absorbed excess thoughts before they formed. I cleaned, rearranged furniture, learned which floorboards creaked. The long groove in the wood faded into background detail, a scar of previous tenants or careless movers. I stopped noticing it entirely, stepping over it without thought. The building had a predictable rhythm. Trash nights, elevator delays, the distant television laugh tracks through thin walls. These familiar irritations grounded me. They made the place feel inhabited in a way that reassured rather than unsettled. Once, I ran into the manager again near the mailboxes. He asked if everything was okay. I said yes, because it was. He nodded, satisfied, as if confirming a private expectation he hadn't shared. Days stacked neatly. I forgot the unease of moving, the loneliness I'd carried in. The apartment became a container for normalcy, holding groceries, deadlines, small plans for the future, nothing more complicated than deciding what to cook. Looking back, this was the calm I would later question. But at the time, it felt earned. The apartment asked nothing of me, and in return, I gave it my trust without hesitation. It started with the mirror in the hallway. Not a reflection doing anything wrong, just a delay I couldn't quite time. When I turned my head, my reflected eyes finished the movement a fraction later, like a bad video stream correcting itself. I tested it again, leaning closer, tilting slowly. The delay vanished. The glass showed me faithfully, even kindly. I laughed under my breath, embarrassed by how quickly my pulse had jumped over nothing measurable. That afternoon, I noticed the couch had shifted a few inches forward. I blamed uneven legs, the way furniture settles when you stop paying attention. Still, I nudged it back, aligning it carefully with the groove in the floor. Later, I found the couch had returned to the same wrong position. Not dramatically, just enough to be irritating. I checked for drag marks, loose screws, anything mechanical. There was nothing that explained repetition with intention. A smell began appearing at odd hours, faint and metallic, like old keys warmed in a pocket. It never lasted long. By the time I stood up to investigate, it thinned into nothing, leaving no source to accuse. Once, while washing dishes, I heard a soft exhale behind me. I turned, expecting the apartment to correct itself again, to prove me jumpy. The room was empty, windows closed, air unmoving, perfectly innocent. The groove in the floor caught my eye more often now. It looked deeper, darker at the edges, though I couldn't swear it had changed. I traced it with my sock, feeling nothing but smooth, worn wood. At night, I began waking just before my alarm, heart already racing as if it had been running without me. No dreams clung to the waking moment, only a sense of having interrupted something mid-thought. I told myself the building was settling, that my routines were syncing poorly with unfamiliar space. Cities did this to people. Apartments amplified small perceptions until they felt meaningful when they weren't. Still, I started keeping lights on longer than necessary. Not out of fear, I insisted, but convenience. It was easier to see everything clearly, even the things I pretended not to be looking for. I made a list of explanations, written casually on a sticky note, as if organization alone could shrink unease. Old building, thin walls, poor lighting, stress. Each item felt reasonable when isolated from the others. The mirror delay became a trick of angle and fatigue. Screens did that to perception, everyone knew it. I adjusted the hallway bulb, replaced it with a brighter one, and stopped checking my reflection altogether. The couch problem had a solution too. I bought rubber stoppers for the legs, wedged them carefully underneath. When it stayed put for 2 days straight, I felt smug, as if I'd outwitted a childish puzzle. Smells drifted in from neighboring apartments, I decided. Metal pipes carried strange ghosts of other people's lives, tools, coins, old radiators. I opened windows more often, letting traffic noise scrub the air clean. The exhale had been my own breathing, amplified by silence. Once I accepted that, the memory lost its edge. Silence can make anything feel close, like your thoughts have grown louder than the room. I blamed the early waking on habit. My body adjusting to a new place, new light angles, new dawn sounds. I reset my alarm later, proving to myself that sleep could be controlled with small authority. I even revisited the groove in the floor with fresh eyes. It was a moving scar, nothing more. Someone careless, someone heavy, someone long gone. Buildings remembered people the way skin remembered injuries. Friends came over for dinner. They laughed, filled the space with noise and heat. Nobody noticed anything wrong. Their comfort felt contagious, and I absorbed it eagerly, like proof I could borrow. When they left, the apartment returned to stillness without complaint. No sounds followed. No smells lingered. I stood alone, pleased with how convincingly normal everything had been all along. That night, I slept deeply, confident I'd solved myself. The apartment felt smaller, tamer, contained by explanations that fit neatly where fear had briefly tried to live. The couch moved again on the third night, stopping at the exact midpoint of the groove. The rubber stoppers were still intact, firmly wedged. I measured the distance twice, annoyed more than alarmed, and shoved it back with deliberate force. The next morning, it had shifted less, but enough to register. Always forward, never sideways, always along that same worn line. I marked its position with tape, a private experiment I didn't bother telling anyone about. The smell returned, stronger now, arriving at the same hour each evening. Not unpleasant, just insistent, like something waiting to be acknowledged. I began checking the time when it appeared, then writing it down. At 9:17 p.m., the hallway light flickered once and stabilized. At 9:17 again the following night, it flickered twice. I replaced the bulb, the switch, even checked the breaker, but the timing didn't change. I started noticing small sounds layered beneath normal ones. The refrigerator hum carried an extra vibration, like breath riding on machinery. Footsteps in the hall paused outside my door longer than seemed accidental. The groove in the floor collected dust faster than anywhere else. I cleaned it repeatedly, yet it darkened again by morning, as if touched, traced, reintroduced to use while I slept. I found a faint handprint on the inside of the bedroom door, smeared low, at a height that suggested kneeling or crawling. It wiped away easily, leaving no residue, no reason to linger in memory. The mirror delay returned, but only at night, only when the lights were dim. I tested it once, then stopped, afraid that repetition itself might be an invitation rather than investigation. I began waking just before 9:17, heart already counting down. Nothing happened immediately. That was the worst part. The waiting stretched thin, like the apartment was teaching me patience. Patterns formed without announcing themselves, each one small enough to deny, but together they pressed inward, rearranging my attention, narrowing my focus until normal life felt like something happening elsewhere. The first time it used my name again, it came from the bedroom, not the living room. The voice matched my own pitch too closely, flattening emotion, like a rehearsal spoken into an empty room. I checked my phone immediately, scrolling for accidental recordings, open apps, anything that could explain hearing myself without intent. The phone was silent, obedient, showing nothing but missed notifications and time. Objects began aligning themselves toward me. Chairs angled inward. The bathroom mirror tilted slightly down. Even the couch, when it moved, stopped closer to where I usually sat, as if learning my habits patiently. The smell started following me from room to room, never ahead, never behind. When I stopped walking, it stopped too, hovering faintly, like a question waiting for an answer I hadn't rehearsed. I found fingerprints on my laptop screen that matched my own, except for the spacing. Too wide, as if my hands had been stretched gently apart before touching the glass, carefully, without urgency. At night, I felt watched only when my eyes were closed. The moment I opened them, the sensation vanished, replaced by ordinary darkness and the faint outline of furniture pretending nothing had happened. Dreams crept in, subtle and administrative. I dreamed of signing forms I didn't remember reading, of agreeing to terms that dissolved when I tried to recall the language. I always woke mid-signature. The hallway mirror no longer reflected my full body unless I stood exactly where the groove ended. Anywhere else, my legs blurred first, thinning until they seemed like an afterthought the glass couldn't maintain. Once, I heard movement beneath the floorboards, matching my pacing step for step. When I stopped, it stopped. When I whispered, it did not answer, but the silence felt practiced. I realized the apartment wasn't reacting randomly. It was responding, adjusting variables, testing what drew my attention longest, what unsettled me most efficiently, like a system refining itself through exposure. I stopped inviting friends over, not out of fear for them, but because the apartment behaved differently when they were present. It withdrew, observed quietly, like it didn't want witnesses yet. That was when it became clear this wasn't about the space alone. Whatever pattern was forming, I was no longer just noticing it. I was the reference point everything else revolved around. When I finally told someone, the words sounded wrong the moment they left my mouth. I heard myself shrinking events, sanding off edges, presenting them as quirks instead of evidence. Their nods came too easily, too practiced. My closest friend suggested stress leave, a weekend away. He said the apartment had probably gotten into my head. I agreed quickly, relieved by how reasonable that sounded, then canceled the trip without understanding why. Phone calls dropped more often inside the apartment. Not dramatically, just enough to fracture conversations into apologies and repeated sentences. Texts sent from my couch arrived garbled, auto-corrected into meanings I hadn't intended. I stopped mentioning the building to anyone. It felt safer to let conversations orbit work, weather, trivial plans. The apartment seemed to reward silence, growing calmer when I kept it out of other people's mouths. The manager stopped returning my emails. When I went downstairs, his office was locked during posted hours. A handwritten sign said "back soon." The ink faded like it had been waiting a long time. Neighbors I'd spoken to before began avoiding eye contact. Doors closed softly when I entered the hallway. Once, I heard someone whisper my apartment number, followed by a pause heavy with something like resignation. Delivery drivers left packages in the lobby instead of bringing them upstairs. One apologized without meeting my eyes, saying the elevator made him uneasy lately, though it had worked perfectly moments before. I tried sleeping at a hotel across town. The room felt aggressively empty, hostile in its normalcy. I barely slept. By morning, I was already imagining the apartment's familiar quiet, its contained, attentive darkness. When I returned, the door unlocked easily, like it had been waiting. The smell greeted me immediately, warm and precise. I felt a strange relief stepping back inside, as if isolation had finally been acknowledged properly. That night, I understood something I hadn't admitted before. The apartment wasn't keeping others away by force. It was making sure I stopped reaching out on my own, one reasonable decision at a time. I found the lease inside a wall, folded neatly behind the hallway mirror. My signature appeared at the bottom, dated years earlier, written in a steadier hand than mine, on paper yellowed with time I couldn't place. The names above mine were familiar. Not people I knew, but names I remembered reading on packages mis-delivered to my door, on mail I'd returned without thinking. Each signature followed the same careful slant, slightly adjusted, like practice. The groove in the floor wasn't from dragging furniture. It traced the exact route between mirror, couch, and bedroom, the path I walked every night. The wood wasn't worn down. It was polished, layered smooth by repetition. The voice I heard wasn't copying me. It was reminding me. Each tenant learned their own cadence eventually, enough to call themselves back when they drifted too far from routine, too close to leaving. I understood then why the apartment felt attentive. It wasn't alive in the way people meant. It was occupied by habits, by imprints that needed a body to replay them, someone to keep the pattern intact. The cheap rent wasn't a lure. It was compensation. Payment for staying long enough to become consistent, predictable, useful. Another stable version of the same life the apartment had been rehearsing for years.